My name is Lorith Van Kest, and I was never supposed to be aboard the 9th aspect for the 13th harvest. I was a conscript technician, 3 months out of the calibration halls, assigned to threading duty because the officer above me broke her wrist on a stair rail, and nobody else was free. I want that on the record, because everything that happened afterward, I watched from the tender at the back of the formation, and I have spent every day since being grateful for a broken wrist that was not mine. The Ashryn Loom does not forget a debt, and Osrith Hollow owed us 4 centuries of failure. 12 times before this one, our reality weavers had sailed into that storm-locked world and tried to unweave the maelstrom that sat over its northern basin like a held breath, and 12 times the weave had come back empty, torn, or not at all. The storm was old before the loom had ships that could cross the dark. It devoured probes. It devoured the eager. Elders spoke of it the way you speak of weather that has a grudge. This time we had new gear. Extraction anchors, threaded through 58 hulls, tuned to bind and drain any anomalous field no matter how it fought us. Commander Vesik Arnthal stood on the 9th Aspect's bridge and told the assembled fleet that Osrith Hollow's maelstrom was going to feed the loom for a generation, and I believed her, because everyone around me believed her, and belief is a current that is hard to swim against when you are new and frightened and 22 years old. We came down through the high atmosphere in formation. 58 ships in a lattice 100 kilometers wide, our anchor threads trailing behind us like a net dragged behind a boat too slow to know it was fishing for something that could see it coming. The storm sat below us, a churning gray-green wall 400 kilometers across, lightning inside it in patterns nobody had ever explained. Our sensors read it as an anomalous ionic reality field, Class 9, unclassified origin. That was the same reading every prior expedition had logged. Nobody asked why a storm 4 centuries old had never once drifted, never once weakened, never once behaved like weather actually behaves. I asked, quietly, to the technician beside me, a woman named Sethra who had done 2 harvest cycles already, and had the patience of someone who no longer expected answers. She told me storms don't need permission to be strange, and to watch my board. Before the threads went in, there was an hour of nothing to do but wait, and I looked at the maelstrom the way you look at something you have only seen in training footage. It filled a third of the sky from the tender's forward port, gray-green shot through with veins closer to violet than lightning has any right to be, and it made no sound at all, which felt worse than if it had. Sethra said the old harvest logs described the same silence, century after century, and that nobody had ever thought to ask why a storm with no sound had never needed to make one. So I watched my board, and at 1400 hours ship time, the anchor threads went in. For the first 6 minutes it worked exactly as the Elder Scrolls said it should. The storm resisted, thrashed, threw back power surges that blackened 3 anchor heads outright. Vesik ordered more threads deployed, tightened the lattice, brought all 58 ships into a single linked extraction circuit so the drain would have nowhere left to escape. The storm's resistance felt like anger. It felt, I remember thinking, like something fighting for its life, and I remember being embarrassed by the thought, because storms don't have lives to fight for. Then the resistance stopped being angry and started being precise. The lightning inside the maelstrom slowed to a rhythm, not chaos slowing down, a rhythm, evenly spaced, counting. I watched it on my board because counting is the one thing weather has never in the history of the loom's records done. Sethra saw it too. She stopped breathing for a second, the way you do when your body understands something before your mind is caught up to it. The storm's core, the wall of gray-green that our threads were buried in up to the anchor housings, began to fold inward along lines too straight to be a coincidence of physics. It was not dissipating under our drain. It was closing around us, gathering itself the way a hand gathers into a fist. Using our own extraction lattice, the 100-kilometer net we had strung between 58 ships to make sure nothing could slip free, as the frame to close around. I understood it the way you understand a fall only after you have already left the ledge. The storm had never been weather, never an anomaly, in the sense the loom scrolls meant. It was a shape, deliberately made and maintained for 400 years, by something patient enough to let 12 failed harvests come and go without revealing what waited underneath, because 12 harvests had never brought enough ships, never linked them into one continuous circuit the way our new gear had finally, obligingly done for it. The wall opened at its center like a wound, and the thing inside was not weather at all. It was a hull, longer than the 9th aspect by a factor I did not have time to calculate before my board stopped giving me useful numbers. Iron gray, scarred along every visible plate, running lights dark except for a slow amber pulse along its spine that looked less like machinery and more like something breathing. It did not accelerate toward us. It did not need to. It was already inside the net we had built, already touching every thread we had strung between our 58 ships, and in the second before the ninth aspect's proximity alarms found words for what was happening, the hull did something to our own extraction lattice that our own engineers had built to be impossible to misuse. It reversed the drain. Every anchor thread we had sunk into the storm to pull power out began instead to feed power in, not from the hull, but from us, ship to ship, along the very circuit Vesic had ordered closed to keep the storm from escaping. 58 ships, linked in series, and the current ran backward through all of them at once. I watched 3 vessels on the western arc go dark within the same second, their reactors answering a demand no engineer had designed them to survive. The ninth aspect's own lights flickered, steadied, flickered again, and Commander Vesic's voice on the open channel went from an order to a question, to nothing at all, in that order, inside about 4 seconds. I do not know how many of the 58 understood, in their final moments, that the trap had been the storm the whole time, and that the storm had been waiting specifically for a fleet arrogant enough, or desperate enough, or simply thorough enough, to finally link every ship together for it. I know that I understood it only because the tender I was aboard, small, unarmored, positioned at the rear of the formation for exactly the kind of malfunction that saved me, had its own anchor thread snap early, its housing cracked from an earlier surge. 3 minutes before the reversal reached us, we drifted free of the circuit. We watched the rest of it from 4 kilometers out, which in a collapse of that size might as well have been a different world. 14 minutes. That is what the tender's own log shows, start to finish. From the first counted flash of lightning, to the last ship going dark. 55 of 58 vessels lost, the ninth aspect among them. 3 of us drifted home on a cracked thread tender, with no weapons, no commander, and nothing to report that anyone in the archive halls would believe without the log data to prove it. The hull did not pursue us. It did not fire on the 3 ships that survived. It simply held position at the center of what had been our extraction lattice, amber pulse along its spine slowing, steadying, and then the storm folded back around it, gray-green and churning, and utterly ordinary looking, exactly as it had looked for 400 years before we arrived, and exactly as it would look, I have no doubt, for however long it takes the loom to forget this and try again. I filed the report myself, because no one senior enough to file it survived. I wrote that Osrith Hollow's maelstrom is not an anomalous field. I wrote that it is a warship, marooned or hidden or simply patient beyond anything the loom has a word for, and that it has spent 4 centuries teaching every failed harvest exactly how it plans to be freed the next time someone brings enough ships and enough rope. I recommended, in the last line of the report, that the loom never send a 14th expedition. I do not expect that recommendation to be honored. Debts, the elders say, are not forgiven simply because the collector is patient, and a cult that has lost to the same silence for 4 centuries tends to call the 13th failure bad luck rather than a lesson. But I was on the tender with the cracked thread, and I am the only technician from the ninth aspect who gets to have an opinion about it at all, so I wrote it down anyway. Some nights I run the tender's log back to the last clean frame before the storm closed over the hull, and I look at that slow amber pulse along its spine one more time. It was not resting. It was simply waiting again, the way it had waited for 400 years before us, patient enough to let the next foolish fleet finish tying its own knot. I have not stopped watching the sky since.